Welcome back. We are in Chapter 3 of Indian Captive on page 38, Fort Duquesne. I know that looks weird, but it's Duquesne, I believe. We're going to say Duquesne. Oh, Molly, are we never going to stop walking? Asked Davy, looking down at his feet. The once bright-colored embroidery on the moccasins was faded now and covered with mud. I wish I knew, said Molly sadly. I feel as if we've been walking all our lives, but see how tough our feet have grown. Why did they make us run so fast? Asked Davy. They were afraid of being followed, I think, replied Molly. Like as not they knew there were white men on our trail. Like as not John and Tom ran to neighbor Dixon and he gathered the neighbors from Marsh Creek Hollow together. Oh, why didn't they come to save us? Wailed Davy. They couldn't catch up, answered Molly slowly. We went so fast. She stole a glance at the young man captive, whose coming had brought back her hope. If only she could rouse him. He talked a little now as they walked down the mountainside. He said his name was Nicholas Porter, and he came from Piney Mountain near Shippens Town, only a few miles as the crow flies from Marsh Creek Hollow. He told how one morning his mother wanted squirrel for pot pie. He insisted that squirrel pot pie, made by his mother, was the best dish in the land. He told how he went out hunting to take a few squirrels for pot pie, and how he'd been caught like a squirrel himself, by hunters stronger than he. He kept on talking about the squirrel pot pie that his mother would never make again, and he himself would never eat. He told the tale so often that Molly wearied of it. If only he could forget his suffering. There were more important things to think of. If only he could fasten his mind on the idea of escape. All the time now, the slopes went downward, as the highest mountains were left behind. Though the party moved at more moderate pace and no attempt was made to conceal the trail, they rarely paused or stopped. A day came when the hills behind were but a blue haze in the distance, and they walked across a wooden plain. At the brink of a steep hill, they halted to gaze on a wandering stream below, but only for a moment. Down the rough, precipitous trail, they plunged to the red clay shore of Turtle Creek. The current was strong, and the waters were high from recent springtime freshets, but not even an angry stream could hold them back. The Indians brought out a bark canoe, which they found concealed near the shore, and the creek was crossed in safety. Another climb up the steep hill opposite, and the party came out on the plain again, following in single file the trail that skirted the shore of the Allegheny River. One day, in mid-afternoon, they saw ahead across the flat river bottoms a large log stockade. To Molly, the sight was welcome. She wondered what fort it was. Eagerly, she watched the lips of Frenchmen and Indians, hoping to catch its name. Then she heard it, two words she had heard before on the lips of the white trader, Old Fallen Ash. There before her, on the point of land between the arms of two great rivers, the Allegheny and the Monongahela, touched by the afternoon sun, lay Fort Duquesne. This, she knew, was the fort which the French had built only a few years before, when they claimed for their own the whole vast territory drained by the river Ohio. Fort Duquesne! Fort Duquesne! What fate did it hold in store for Molly Jemison, the white girl captive brought over the mountains from Marsh Creek Hollow? She shaded her eyes with her hand to keep out the sun and stared at the uninviting, harsh gray walls. At the corners, the garrison houses loomed up, emblems of strength and terror, making bold, stark patterns against the blue April sky. It's Fort Duquesne we've come to, Molly whispered to Davy Wheelock. Davy stood beside her wearing the same brown-checked homespun garments, torn and shabby now, that he wore when snatched from his mother's side. She gripped his hand tightly in her own. If there's any help coming, we'll find it here, and she began to tremble at the prospect. At the end of the village, the Indians halted, and Molly, too, was obliged to stop, restraining her impatience. She stood there in the pathway, looking hard at the fort which she knew held her for her either freedom or captivity. Dirty, disheveled, browned by exposure, with her clothing torn to shreds, she shifted from one tired foot to the other as she stared at the fort. The setting sun picked up glints of light in her tousled yellow hair and shone into her eyes to blind them. She tried to read a message in the cold, hard stockade walls, but they gave no hint of their secret. Then she saw that the time to enter had not yet come, and she must wait. Preparations of some kind were being made by the Indians, so she sat down, doubling her knees beneath her, and watched. The Indians laid a fire and gathered wood to pile upon it. A pole was raised nearby. Tomahawks were struck into it, and a string of wampum, a belt of beads with design of sacred meaning, was hung at the top. The 12 Indians stood about the fire, smoking peacefully, while the Frenchmen and the 3 captives waited. The smoke signal seen, an Indian messenger soon advanced from the village. Seeing the peaceful intent of the newcomers, he bade them welcome, and the ceremony was concluded, but still the party was not ready to advance. The old Indian, Shagbark, friendly as before, approached Davy and Nicholas and motioned them to sit down. He brought out a crude bone comb from his pack and painstakingly combed their blonde hair. He combed out briars and tangles, then shaved their heads clean except for a strip from forehead to neck, which he dressed in Seneca fashion. Molly's hair he left hanging loose and free about her shoulders, a shower of shining gold. Then he mixed paint in a shallow stone mortar, and with the cloth-covered end of a stick dauber, painted broad streaks of red across the captives' faces. Molly put up her hands and hid her face in shame. Then she looked at Davy and Nicholas, scarce recognizing them. A strange picture the 3 captives made, a young man, a half-grown girl, a little boy. Their white faces streaked with red. What did it mean? What was going to happen? Were they being prepared for something worse? All we need now is black hair, said Davy bitterly. And black hearts, said Nicholas with a flash of insight. They can change our faces, said Molly, but our hearts they cannot change. She looked down at the red paint which had rubbed off on her hands, and the tears rose to her eyes. They stopped for a moment upon the banks opposite the stockade gate for further parley, and the captives watched the 2 mighty rivers as they flowed into one. There it lay, the great divided river, shining bright and peaceful in the sun. On all the shores, the hills were lined with forest trees in the first full burst of tender green. At the river's edge, the trees grew downward, reflected in the mirror of the silent, peaceful waters. The French call it the River Beautiful, said Nicholas Porter. Oh, hi, oh, River Beautiful. It is beautiful, exclaimed Molly, watching it thoughtfully. But how do you know? La Belle Rivière, Nicholas repeated to her surprise. I heard them say it in French. Do you understand French? Asked Molly. A little, replied Nicholas, falling into silence again. The Indians came to take them into the fort. The walls grew taller as Molly approached. They grew taller and more unfriendly until she felt they would fall and crush her. For one wild moment, she wanted to rush away. Anywhere, back to the wilderness, anywhere to get away. She would live in the forest, eat of its roots and berries, be a friend to the wild beasts. Her thought that moment sprang to action, and quickly her feet obeyed. Before her masters suspected her intention, away she rushed from their grasp. Round the corner like a whirlwind, she dashed on flying feet that scarcely touched the ground. But her escape was only a vein of hope, for stronger pursuers followed close. She felt the jerk of a cruel hand that threw her prostrate and the lash of a stinging whip about her legs. With wild tears falling and body shaking, she was dragged back to the spot from which she had run. There, still standing motionless, Davy and Nicholas welcomed her back with eyes that spoke pity. Then Molly found herself walking across the drawbridge. Inside the log stockade, there was a deep ditch, and on its banks, thick walls of squared logs and earth rose up. Storehouses, dwellings, and barracks built of logs lined the side walls between the tall garrison lookouts. A six-sided stone building stood in one corner. The buildings were bustling with people, and a babble of men's voices speaking in French could be heard. All these things Molly scarcely noticed as she entered the fort enclosure, but other things she did. Certain little things she saw and always remembered long afterward, when Fort Duquesne had faded to a dim and uncertain memory. An outdoor bake oven and several well sweeps stood before the row of doorways. A boy carried a pail full of water across the yard. Near a corner from a log building, 2 cows put out their heads, mooing contentedly. A Frenchman went whistling past the door, carrying hay on a wooden pitchfork. Beside the barn was a tiny garden where plants and fruit trees grew in rows. One of the trees was a peach tree, and because it was April, the tree was in blossom. Molly's homesick heart gave a leap as she saw it. Silhouetted against the deep blue of the sky, the beauty of the pink blossoms overwhelmed her. There had been a peach tree long ago beside the log cabin at home, a peach tree that stood so close you could touch the blossoms from the doorstep. She stared at the blossoming tree in the fort yard. She could only stare at it so hard she would never forget it. She had no time to touch a pink blossom now, to smell its delicate fragrance. Impulsively, she reached out her hand and saw red paint upon it. She turned quickly, for the sight of it filled her with horror. Important-looking French soldiers and Indian chiefs in full regalia bustled out of the largest cabin to meet the arriving band. Words passed, and the 3 captives were hustled indoors without delay. They were taken down a damp hatchway into the cellar of one of the garrisons. Bread was brought, the door was closed and locked, and they were left alone. All night long, the captives sat on a hard wooden bench, staring into darkness. They dared not sleep for fear they might be wanted for some unknown purpose. They talked a little to cheer each other with comfort of human words. For a time, they were hopeful and dreamed of freedom, the happy thought of walking out of the fort without their masters, the thought of home and family, food and comforts. Then they wondered what they could do with freedom if they had it, where they could go if they were free. To the westward and all sides lay an unexplored wilderness. To the eastward, behind them, were the mountains which they had just crossed. They knew, sane reason told them, they could not go back alone, defenseless, following unknown trails, surrounded by wild beasts. So hope died within them. Back to their tired minds came thronging all the stories they had heard of Indian punishments and tortures, and they wondered if they'd been brought thus far to suffer such a fate. After a time, Davy began to cry for his mother and Nicholas to talk of his hunting trip. With a heavy heart, Molly took a hand of each in hers and cheered them as well as she could. Morning came at last. The door opened, and their Indian masters entered, beckoning David Wheelock and Nicholas Porter to come out with them. Obediently, they rose and followed. Molly walked behind them as far as the hatchway door and watched. She saw that the 2 boys were turned over to a group of strange blue-coated Frenchmen like the others who wore lace ruffles on their sleeves. Little Davy looked up inquiring, but Nicholas walked in a daze. Their backs turned toward her, without a sign or gesture. Molly watched them go, never guessing it was for the last time she had looked upon their faces. Those dear friends who had suffered with her and looked to her for comfort, if she had known, could she have let them go? But they never knew it was a parting, nor did she, till they had passed without the gate. Then she ran back to the wooden bench, buried her face in her hands, and fell, sobbing, to the ground. Alone, she lay there, but for how long she neither knew nor cared. The loss of her companion seemed unbearable, and yet she knew that she must bear it. She prayed to God for strength and guidance on the long, dark path that lay before her. She repeated to herself her mother's last words and admonitions, and after a while she dropped asleep. She wakened to hear the sound of whispered voices. Looking up, she saw two figures at the door, women's figures, bunched in clothing, the first women she had seen since she parted from her mother. The light behind them threw dark shadows on their faces, and the words they spoke were strange. They stood a while, looking at her keenly, talking to themselves. Then they came closer, and she saw that their faces were not white faces, but Indian. The women walked toed in, bent forward with shuffling gait. No white woman ever did that. They wore buckskin leggings like men and embroidered moccasins on their feet. No white woman, even in the wilderness, did that. Oh, for the sight of a full-gathered homespun gown with snow-white kerchief and apron. Oh, for the sight of blue eyes of a white woman, eyes of pity and love in a white woman's face. Would she never see that again? The faces that came so close and peered so keenly were not white. They were Indian. The eyes that looked out were not blue, but brown, dark brown, and they showed neither pity nor love, only cold appraisal. The two women lifted the girl from the ground, set her for a moment upon the bench, then bade her rise. She stood still and let them examine her. Why should she care what happened now? Like a frontier farmer looking over a horse or cow he meant to buy, so they looked her over. Were they about to buy her too? They noted her strength of limb and body, the toughness of her muscles, the firmness of her skin. They pinched her cheeks. They looked into her mouth and counted her even white teeth. They kept nodding their heads with approval, smiling shyly and making low, soft sounds. They seemed to be pleased, but the thing that pleased them the most was Molly's hair, her pale yellow, shining hair, the color of ripened corn. They took it in their hands, they blew upon it and tried to braid it. They let it rest like corn silk soft upon their palms. They looked at it as if they had never seen such hair before. After a while they went out, returning again in a moment. This time Molly's Indian masters entered with them. The morning sun made a streak of light brown through the hatchway door, a bright patch in the darkness. The air was filled with words, soft, deep-throated Indian words, spoken with care and deliberation. When the old Indian, Molly's friend on the journey, spoke, the others listened with respect. Were they making a bargain? What were they talking about? Soon it was over. Then they all went up the steps and out once more to sunshine. They walked out from the fort enclosure, but before the great log gate swung to behind them, Molly caught one glimpse of the blossoming peach tree, the tree that had bloomed for her. She saw it standing not where it really was, but close behind the door at home. Then she was out on the river banks, and she saw two bark canoes drawn up close to shore. Her former masters, the old Indian with them, took their places in the larger canoe, the two women and Molly in the smaller. Not till then did the girl realize that she had changed masters. It had been a bargain. She belonged no more to the men who had brought her over the mountain, but to the women in whose canoe she rode. The paddles made soft, gentle sounds as they were lifted up and down, the small canoe following in the wake of the larger. Behind the gray, cold stockade walls of Fort Duquesne grew smaller and smaller, till the fort was only a dark spot in the distance, and that, too, faded away. Ahead lay the wide expanse of shining water, the great river Ohio, the river beautiful. Where were they taking her? Molly sat up straight and tense. She grasped the sides of the canoe with her hands. She lifted her chin and looked ahead. For through her terror, she heard her mother's voice saying, "Have courage, Molly, my child. Be brave. It don't matter what happens if you're only strong and have great courage."